Over the mountains, in a sleepy little village along the Alaskan coast, lived a fairy named Freya. She had eyes the color of wild iris and startling red hair that lit up the sky like a fiery nest. One day, Freya was gathering spider silk to weave into a new dress. She flew through a wildflower meadow when she came upon a stranger, a human girl in grass-stained coveralls and bare feet. Freya had seen humans before, but never up close, and she had never, ever spoken to one. The fairy elders simply wouldn't allow it. Curious, the little fairy studied the barefoot girl with the endless freckles and wavy tangle of chestnut hair, as matted and messy as a horse's mane. She watched the girl tromp through a field of forget-me-not flowers and wild geraniums, her long, spindly toes raking up the delicate plants and ripping them from their roots. Freya trailed close behind, flitting back and forth, propping up plants and tidying after her. Despite all the mischief she caused, Freya grew more curious about the child. It wasn't long before Freya learned the girl's name. She heard her mother's voice call out, "Lunchtime, Nettie!" Freya followed Nettie as she galloped home through a maze of willow and alder to a tidy log cabin with a bright yellow door, where she lived along with her mother and father. Freya noticed Nettie had no brothers or sisters, and her nearest neighbors lived miles down the rocky shoreline. She must get awful lonesome, sighed Freya. Each day after that, Freya watched as Nettie came out alone to play along the black sand beach. There, she'd smash popweed or build forts made of driftwood. Convinced that Nettie needed a friend, Freya had an idea. "I've decided to show myself to the human girl," she announced to her fairy friends. The fairies begged her not to let herself be seen by the girl. "Remember the elders' warning," they cried. "Humans are not to be trusted." But Freya had made up her mind, hoping she and the girl would soon become friends. The next afternoon, Freya watched as Nettie barreled out from behind a tall stand of fireweed, bucking and stomping like a wild filly. With her hands dripping with honey, Nettie ran from a mob of angry bees. She narrowly escaped getting stung by diving into a muddy muskeg and hiding behind a large leafy skunk cabbage. After the bees returned to their hive, Nettie crept out of the muck and shook herself off, spraying muddy water everywhere. Giggling, Freya was all the more enchanted with the strange and spirited young girl, who now looked more like a stringy Sasquatch than a human child. That night, Freya lay down in a field of wildflowers. Sheltered by lupin and chocolate lilies, she fell asleep under a blanket of swirling color, dreaming of friendship and new adventures as the northern lights twirled and danced above her. In the morning, Freya awoke with a start when Nettie clambered past her, carrying a large glass mason jar, the kind used for canning salmon. Holding the jar in one hand, Nettie leapt like a lynx between sturdy pushki stalks and prickly devil's club plants. Nettie pawed through the tall grass, and after a while she reappeared, triumphantly waving her jar, now chock full of caterpillars and other magnificent creatures. Just then, from the cabin with the bright yellow door, a voice rang out, "Nettie, time for lunch!" Nettie screwed the lid on the jar and trotted away, leaving the jar on a cottonwood stump in the mid-morning sun. "Oh no," cried Freya. "Those little critters will cook in that jar." Freya called on her fairy friends, Chloe and Finn, for help, but try as they might, they could not budge the lid of the jar. As luck would have it, a mischievous magpie happened by. "Over here, Magpie," Freya hollered, jumping up and down. The bright-eyed bird landed on the stump next to the jar. "How would you like to play a friendly game of Capture the Fairy?" asked Freya. The bird resounded with a cackling caw that Freya took for a yes. They started the game off slowly. Then faster and faster they sped in circles, whirling around the jar in a flurry of feathers and fairy wings. Whack! The bird struck the jar with its long tail feathers. The lid flew off the jar before it hit the ground. The caterpillars, earthworms, beetles, and dragonflies that Nettie had collected were tossed high into the air. Then, like confetti, they trickled down and landed gently in the tall grass. "Whew! That was close," squealed Chloe. "You still want that human for a friend?" asked Finn. "No harm was done," shrugged Freya, once again sticking up for the naughty little barefoot girl. Later that day, Freya and her friends napped in an eagle's nest. The fledglings had long since flown, so the fairies had the nest to themselves. Nestled high in the bough of a towering spruce tree, the winds off the glacier blew through the branches, rocking them gently. They were almost asleep when they heard a rustling below. It was Nettie, holding a bouquet of Arctic daisies in her fist. "Oh, how sweet!" Freya exclaimed. "I'll bet she picked those for her mother." "I doubt that," chirped Finn. They watched Nettie plop down near a patch of stinging nettles. The fairies winced as Nettie plucked petal after petal from the plants, tossing them over her shoulder and leaving them to wither on the ground. "I've seen enough," cried Chloe. "Doesn't she know flowers have feelings too?" "You can't seriously still want to be friends with that bully," said Finn. Freya wasn't listening. She stuffed her ears with soft tufts of cotton grass so she couldn't hear what her friends had to say. The fairies flew off in a huff and left Freya alone in the nest. Freya looked down at Nettie. The girl's legs were red and itchy from the stinging nettles. The sad pile of droopy petals sat next to her on the ground. Freya's tiny heart sank as she stared at the lonely-looking child. Nettie jumped up and brushed herself off. She spotted the mason jar lying empty on the ground near the stump. She dusted it off and tucked it into the pouch of her coveralls. In the distance, Freya saw a swarm of butterflies swirling in a kaleidoscope of color. Mesmerized by the swarm, Freya barely noticed Nettie building a net from bits of twine and pieces of an old herring gill net that she'd found washed up on the beach. The girl took clumsy swipes at the air with the net, practically falling over from the weight of it. Nettie came closer and closer to the butterflies, so close that Freya swooped down from the tree to warn them. Suddenly, swoosh! The butterflies scattered, but the little fairy was caught in a thick tangle of web. "Ouch!" cried Freya as Nettie pushed her into the mason jar and slammed a rusty lid over the top. "Why didn't I listen to my friends?" Freya pictured them now, frolicking in the forest while she was trapped, a prisoner in a canning jar. She saw the ground get further and further away through the thick glass bottom of the jar. Suddenly she was looking into a gigantic pair of human eyes. "Let me out of here!" Freya yelled. Nettie's ears pricked up. A talking butterfly? Impossible! "You're not a butterfly," said the girl. You're a fairy!" "That's right," said the fairy. "My name is Freya. If you let me out of here, we can be friends and you won't have to play all by yourself anymore." "I'm perfectly happy playing by myself, and I don't need any friends," snapped Nettie. "Of course you do. Everyone should have at least one friend," Freya replied. "Not me," insisted Nettie, turning the jar to look at Freya from all sides. Freya ducked as Nettie pulled out a hammer and nail and punched air holes into the rusty lid. How long was Nettie planning to hold her captive? Freya wondered. "Let me go!" cried Freya. "If I'm away from the forest for more than 2 days, I'll wither and fade. There will be nothing left of me, nothing but dust." But Nettie refused to listen. Instead, she skipped happily down the path toward the tidy log cabin with the bright yellow door, while Freya bumped and jostled against the insides of the dreary glass jar. When Nettie reached the cabin, Her grandparents were there waiting for her. Nettie forgot she had promised to spend the night with them on an island a short boat ride away. She knew she had to go. So while her grandparents chatted with her mother, Nettie quickly gathered some unripe blueberries, dandelion greens, a chocolate cookie, and a thimbleful of water. She slid them into the jar carefully so that Freya couldn't escape. "That should hold you," she said, as she placed the jar on a shelf in her bedroom. "I have to go now, but I'll be back tomorrow." Before Freya could utter a single word, the human girl was gone. Frightened and alone, Freya crouched down, her wings pressed against the sticky glass wall. Shivering, she wrapped the dandelion leaf around her like a blanket. Freya tried to be brave, but before she knew it, she was ankle-deep in her own little fairy tears. When Nettie returned home the next day, she couldn't wait to see the fairy again. She was so excited, she jumped out of her grandparents' skiff before it reached the shore. Tripping over her wet clothes, Nettie raced up the stairs, but as she peered into the jar, her excitement faded. Freya's eyes had lost their sparkle. Her skin, once pink and rosy, was as white as the snow on the mountains, and she looked smaller than the day before. "What's wrong with you?" asked Nettie. "I told you," said Freya, her voice barely a whisper. "I won't last much longer in this jar. Fairies need their freedom, like humans need air." "You're just saying that so I'll let you go," replied Nettie. "I'll bet you're just hungry." Nettie ran outside. She quickly returned with a handful of juicy salmon berries and plump rose hips, which she crammed into the jar. She added chickweed, nettles, and fiddlehead ferns, then scoured the shoreline for fresh seaweed and bullwhip kelp. By the time she had finished stuffing the jar, there was barely room left inside for Freya. "Stop!" Freya shouted, pinching her little nose tight with her tiny fairy hands. "I need fresh air, not food," she cried. "I can hardly breathe in here." But Nettie couldn't hear Freya. As the fairy grew weaker, her words faded like the distant hum of a whiny mosquito. The girl studied the fairy again. She really was getting smaller. Her luminous wings had lost all their shimmer. As Nettie stared wide-eyed at the disappearing fairy, her bottom lip began to quiver, and her tummy felt funny inside. Right then, Nettie knew she had to get Freya back to her woodland home. Fast! Clutching the jar, Nettie raced down the stairs to the front door. Her mother was standing in front of it and stopped her. "You can't go out there," Nettie's mother warned. "Why not?" asked Nettie. She pointed, and Nettie saw a great big black bear munching on a bag of birdseed left out on the front porch. Frantic, Nettie raced up the stairs and flung open her bedroom window. She hoped Freya would be strong enough to fly back to her woodland home. Nettie unscrewed the rusty lid and gently placed the jar sideways on the windowsill. Freya crawled out and stood up, brushing the leaves and crumbs and bits of berry off her leafy skirt. She slowly regained strength from the breeze and the smell of spruce needles in the air. All at once, her wings began to shimmer, and with a little hop, she was in the air. "Wait!" cried Nettie. Freya turned to hear what Nettie had to say. "I'm sorry," said Nettie, with tears running down her freckled cheeks. "It was wrong to trap you, and I'll never trap another creature again. You said you wanted to be my friend. Will you still be my friend?" Freya hovered for a minute, close to Nettie's face. She did not answer, but she let the beating of her delicate wings dry the little girl's tears before she flew off toward her woodland home. Once back in the fresh air of the forest, Freya recovered quickly from her time in the jar. "Hooray!" shouted Freya's fairy friends as they leapt for joy at the sight of her. They decided to throw a great big fairy potlatch and invite all their friends from both sides of the bay. The pixies, the sprites, the long-legged moose, and the great horned owl were just a few of the creatures that joined in the celebration. Even the slippery little sea otters snuck away from their kelp beds to join the fun. But the greatest surprise of all came to Freya when she spotted Nettie, the human girl, nestled in among the others. Freya fluttered over to Nettie and landed lightly on her shoulder. Smiling, Nettie held an open hand up to the little fairy. Freya climbed into Nettie's palm, and as they looked at one another, they knew that this was just the beginning of a long and lasting friendship between a brave Alaskan fairy and an adventurous little girl.